Tracy.
Hello, welcome to Dateline London. I'm Carrie Gracie, and this week, banish doomsters and gloomsters, celebrate the awesome foursome. If optimism packaged in a soundbite was the key to breaking Brexit deadlock, then Boris Johnson would probably be the choice of many. But is it enough? Today we devote the whole programme to the challenges facing the new British Prime Minister. And my guests, British political commentator Alex Dean, US television journalist, US Canadian television journalist Geoffrey Kaufman, Irish broadcaster Brian O'Connell, and French journalist Nabila Ramdani. Welcome to you all. So if the ball comes loose from the back of the scrum, that is a rugby phrase Boris Johnson himself once used to talk about the opportunity to become party leader and Prime Minister. The ball came loose, is now in his hands, but there is a lot standing between this player and his try. Parliament has blocked the Brexit deal agreed by his predecessor, but nor is Parliament prepared to tolerate no deal. The EU says the deal it agreed is not up for renegotiation. The public remain profoundly divided. The pound is weakening. The new Prime Minister is boxed in by unforgiving political and economic realities, a chameleon and joker at a moment which demands strategy and execution. And yet, Alex, does this first week of Boris Johnson in office suggest that behind the joker's mask there is a steely strategist?
I think this has been an amazing start. I don't think anyone can deny, whatever you think of Boris or the Tory agenda, there is a sense of purpose and dynamism and energy which has really transformed Westminster. It feels like an entirely different political environment. And you see it in the Westminster Village. You see the way that journalists are responding to these discussions and the enlivened situation, the press conference that you guys are just covering live. This is not what we've had for the last few years. And with no disrespect to Theresa May or her government, it just feels like this administration has had a real shot in the arm and a shot of positivity, which I think is all to the good. The other thing I would really emphasise is this, that the British electorate, leave or remain, is pretty sick and tired of talking about Brexit. And so in this kind of the first 100 days that any politician focuses on, Boris's domestic agenda that has been set out with all of these new cabinet ministers has been received exceptionally, I think, positively, because it's talking about what we're going to do as a country in addition to Brexit. And I think all of those things, whether it be more police officers, funding and approaching in schools, or indeed what he is saying on Brexit and an attempt to resolve things in a different way to his predecessor, I think all of it's a positive thing in the right direction.
Nabila, you next. Do you agree with Alex? Do you see it as a good first week?
Well, I think all the policies that Boris Johnson is coming up with at the moment are a clear distraction from the overwhelming issue of Brexit. He's trying to give the impression that he'll get stuck in government jobs and involving such things as economic revival. But the one thing that's high on people's mind is that single issue, which is Brexit, and that's what his administration will be judged on. And I think there's a fascination, actually, in watching the Boris Johnson administration unfold. But I can't pretend it's a positive fascination. Instead, there is a chilling and rather freakish aspect to the whole debacle. On the one hand, it's by far the most viciously right-wing and indeed brutish conservative government any of us can remember. And on the other hand, they're actually making out that they have the guile and sensitivity to deliver and to sort out one of the most divisive issues in British history. The reality is a restrained British government has failed miserably to deliver Brexit in 3 years, and yet Mr Johnson is now pretending that he's going to sort everything out by Halloween. The reality is that he has a tiny majority in Parliament. Most of his competent ministers, potential ministers, have either resigned or been sacked and humiliated, and the EU has made it abundantly clear that they don't want to negotiate anymore. And there's a distinctly Trump-style feel to this government. It feels maverick, it feels unpredictable, and yet Mr Johnson thinks that the sheer power of his personality can now change everything. The truth is, he's himself a very divisive figure, and he surrounded himself by politicians who are even more so.
Jeffrey, we've heard two contending realities painted. Which do you subscribe to?
Well, I think it is fascinating to watch a master communicator take the helm after May's halting inability, inauthentic way of communicating. And I think what's so fascinating, in this week of this extraordinary heat wave of climate change, we have this political climate change that parallels it and really parallels and reflects what's happened across the Atlantic in the United States. We have this populist leader with the ability to really connect with at least a certain sector of people and mobilize that sector with impassioned rhetoric. The question is, can he actually deliver? This is a man who is extremely agile with words, and it's fun to listen to him. But ultimately, as we've noted, he's got 90 days to deliver Brexit. We have the EU intransigent, and these are not just political matters; they're emotional, nationalistic matters. And so to assume that rational thought on the EU side or here will prevail means that we're really driving down a road in the fog, being told, yes, let's follow. We promised we would get you there. We don't know if there's a cliff. There's so many assumptions about Brexit, and yet this hell or high water, full speed ahead, damn the torpedoes approach has no consideration of the consequence. None of us can predict what a hard Brexit would do. It's fair to say that it might be okay, but it might be catastrophic, and yet we're being told that's where we're going.
Brian, before we follow up with Jeffrey's point about the fog and heading for the for those 100 days, just deal for a moment with the first week. What's your assessment?
It's not often I agree with Alex on this programme. I do agree with him on one thing, though. It is like a breath of fresh air in a very hot and humid Westminster at the moment. And as Jeffrey says, he is a very good communicator. Having said all that, he's still in campaign mode. And the campaign is over and the delivery has to start. Now, Boris Johnson is very good at campaigning. He's not very good at details. He'd probably admit that himself. He delegated a lot when he was Mayor of London, and he'll probably have to delegate even more now. The problem is that being Prime Minister is all about the detail, not least in Brexit and the backstop and everything else that we can talk about later. But initially, I think it is a very good strategy to actually talk about the sort of things we've just seen him talking about in Manchester, about infrastructure, about all the other things, because people at large, the voters, are fed up listening to politicians arguing about Brexit.
Well, sadly, we're going to do that more in the next few minutes. But Alex, can I just get you to deal with, behind the atmospherics of the first week, what about the Cabinet? Because there's some serious charges laid by Nabila. What's your response to the figures we've seen promoted?
Well, the first thing I would say is that being Prime Minister isn't all about details. It is about agenda setting and delegating, and that's an important part of a role, and that's what he did as Mayor of London. And I think we'd welcome delegation to good ministers. The second thing I think is remarkable, this is the most diverse Cabinet in British history. Two British Asians in very senior roles, our first Asian Chancellor, two black people attending Cabinet, Kwasi Kwarteng, and of course James Cleverly, the first black chairman of my party. And I look to what's happening and the way those people are being treated. Sometimes HuffPost said that we shouldn't let young people see these ministers because their internalised whiteness means they're not really Asian. That's how people are being treated in these senior roles.
You talk about diverse. I believe that 64% of this cabinet went to fee-paying public schools, what we call private schools, and in a country where 7% of the population, that is not a reflection of this country.
I know that it will never satisfy those like you that criticise our government to say, well, you wanted diversity, look at this. No, I need another kind of diversity now. They're the wrong kind of Asians, or they're the wrong black people.
But it's a monoculture. It's a monoculture of privilege.
Alex answered that point, though. There is, the question of socio-economic diversity, class diversity is a real question. You've got all these old Etonians running.
If you satisfy one issue, of course, the left will turn to the next and say that's what you're getting.
It's not about left. I'm not left. I'm just bemused that in this country that is with the mother of all parliaments, that where democracy has such history, that the upper class continues to dominate.
I don't know about upper class. I went to a comprehensive throughout my time as a schoolboy because that's where my parents sent me, and I'm sick and tired of people in our country being blamed for where their parents sent them to go to school. It wasn't their choice. It wasn't your choice where you went to school. It wasn't my choice where I went, and it wasn't theirs either. And it's a way of avoiding the real issues.
We're going to leave the diversity point and go back to the way that the new cabinet divides on Brexit, because I suppose what interested a lot of people in the first week was that Brexiteers who had been disloyal to Boris Johnson were out of the cabinet in some cases, and Remainers who were loyal to Boris Johnson were promoted. So it wasn't, belief in Brexit was not the defining thing for him.
And I think that's a good thing, that he didn't say, right, this is a government only of Brexiteers. I think that would have been too exclusionary. But this is a government in a hurry. And this government wants to get things done quickly. And what Boris did was to require those who formerly had been Remain campaigners to sign up effectively to collective cabinet government, something which many of us might think has been sadly missing for some time in recent political events, and to say you are going to get behind and subscribe to the belief that we are coming out on the 31st of October, whether or not you campaigned for Remain in the past. I think that's good. But the other thing I think about these cabinet appointments is this, that we've finally got a sense of direction and dynamism within cabinets in their domestic roles rather than just around Brexit. So apart from Michael Gove, who was set on banning things left, right and centre in the environment, most of our cabinet ministers were stymied by a mix of austerity on the one hand and the focus on Brexit on the other. Now we've got Esther McVey going out and really hammering home the idea of new houses for housing policy. We've got proper attitudes and attempt to build more policing on our streets.
Still is Brexit.
But my point is you can do both. And for so long, our political environment has been so dominated by the Brexit discussion that our domestic agenda, which people care about, has been dropped away.
If, as Boris Johnson says, he wants to renegotiate the withdrawal agreement, and he's got, 90 days or so, and about 20-something, 24 of those will be parliamentary sitting days. He's not going to have much time for doing anything else other than Brexit.
That's a different question. And it has been indicated, of course, that our Parliament can sit late and can sit on days it wouldn't normally sit if required. So the days may be longer than that. And bear in mind, you can get things done in Parliament if you've got a will to. And that's what I take such comfort from. This is plainly a government that's got a determination to finish things.
Alex, I agree with you that what Johnson is doing is what the people of this country want, which is talking about things other than Brexit. There's no question that everyone is fed up with the single topic that has dominated for the last 3 years. And how brilliant to go up to Manchester Saturday morning to announce HS3 connecting the North, which feels so disenfranchised and so angry at the amount of investment in infrastructure we've seen in London. And it is terrific here. If some of it were to open, it would be even better. But, I think it is a masterful stroke, and it is actually responding to what the people want. But the problem in that agenda is that there is this clock ticking, and it doesn't have long, and there are so many uncertainties. And this notion that we're going to see it reopened, maybe, but it doesn't. I don't see how. The Irish border and the backstop, how does that get resolved? There are massive existential questions that need answers in 3 months.
And do you see, sorry, Nabila, you go next. Do you see answers emerging from what we've heard from the Prime Minister?
Well, I must dwell on, the credibility of this government, if I may. And I want to focus on Ms. Patel, his Home Secretary, who, in my view, personifies the freakish nature of this government. This is someone who was a far from popular ex-lobbyist for the alcohol and tobacco industries. She's apparently still a lobbyist, a £1,000 an hour lobbyist, and potentially in clear breach of the ministerial code.
She'll have to stop doing that as Home Secretary.
Indeed, but what we know, this is also somebody who was forced out of government because of, as international secretary, development secretary, because of her underhand dealings with the Israeli government. Effectively, she was offering humanitarian aid to.
We don't have time to do the backstory of Priti Patel. On the question of the Brexit offer as made by the new Prime Minister, where do you think his new cabinet and he himself are taking us? What signs do you see at this point?
Well, I think, most of all the new ministers in Boris Johnson's government have this air of menace about them, just as Priti Patel does, and none of them have proven record of sorting out complicated policy problems, and that's a huge worry. And I think that it's absolutely ludicrous to think that Britain can actually break away from the trading bloc it's surrounded by. The only way this clean break can happen is if Britain change its actual geographical position, which of course won't happen. And my own prediction is that Mr. Johnson will strike a deal with Nigel Farage's Brexit party for electoral support, and Nigel Farage, in return for full-blooded Brexit as a carrot, And Nigel Farage, being a wily politician, will have no qualms whatsoever in pushing his own populist agenda in joining forces with Boris Johnson.
Is that a possible scenario in your world?
Well, I just don't recognise the characterisation of the people we're talking about. Sajid Javid, our first Asian Chancellor, son of a bus driver, perhaps not diverse enough for the wrong kind of Asian for some people, but nevertheless I think a significant fact, has a long track record at Deutsche Bank in finance. I don't know what you find threatening or brutish about that.
Most of his cabinet ministers.
All right, but let's agree that most people thought that his appointment of Chancellor was going to be the most significant appointment that Boris would make around the cabinet table. Seems you're silent on that one. I would think that's a good thing. As far as the scenarios for Brexit that you're setting out are concerned, actually I view things more positively than Geoffrey and Nabila have just set out. I look to the fact that Angela Merkel says that the backstop can be overwritten, and I contrast that with some of the earlier statements that we heard from people like Barnier saying nothing could change. Plainly, the heads of national government are looking to do a deal in this closing time. And you are right to point out that time is short. But sometimes that's when people make moves that mean negotiations come off and deals happen. Sometimes it is pressure of time that means you get a result in negotiations. And the other thing that means you get a result in negotiations sometimes is if you change the people at the table, you change the negotiation.
You're absolutely right. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes it's not. And that's what's scary about the next 90 days. Because you might be right, Alex. I think all of us would be delighted to see whatever the outcome, a smooth transition to whatever, and we move on, and this country grows and flourishes. But the sometimes it's a pretty big caveat.
Can I just bring Brian in on the backstop? Because this is, ostensibly such a big issue.
Yes.
Alex is suggesting it may not be as serious a problem. What do you think?
It is a huge problem, and it is going to be a problem. And I don't understand what Angela Merkel means when she says it can be overwritten. There is certainly room in the political declaration, which is annexed to the withdrawal agreement, to be tweaked and the wording changed slightly. But everybody from Michel Barnier to the Irish, the Germans, the French say that that negotiation is not going to be reopened. Now, the new Prime Minister says...
That's a negotiating position, right?
Well, yes. So the new Prime Minister's negotiating position is to go in into the room saying, I'm not going to sit in that chair unless you drop the backstop. That is not a good opening negotiating position for the British government, the new British government. And it's not going to work.
And saying you won't talk about it on the other side isn't a good one either.
No.
So they're going to meet somewhere in the middle.
No. For example, the Irish government, there was a lot of sabre rattling.
Yeah.
The underlying relationship between the British and Irish governments is exceptionally good. The Irish government have welcomed the appointment of Julian Smith, the former Chief Whip, as Northern Ireland Secretary and so on, and there is signs of progress on getting Stormont up and running. But in terms...
Stormont being the devolved assembly.
Stormont being the devolved assembly that hasn't been sitting for, 2017, 2 years and a bit. However, on the issue of the backstop, keeping the border open and everything else, the Irish, they actually have no room to move except to increase their no-deal preparations, which they are doing. They have for quite a long time been talking quite openly about what they've been doing on the east-west axis, Dublin Port and Rosslare and that kind of thing. And they've been talking less about the north-south border because it is more politically sensitive, but that work has been going on quite intensively. Now, the problem with the whole thing is that the backstop cannot be taken out or overwritten simply because it is the guarantee, and I know there have been other proposals that involve the GATT24 provisions and so on, whereby the backstop could be negotiated further down the line in the free trade agreement. But it has been made very clear by Barnier, by Varadkar and numerous others
that it can't come out.
That it has to be agreed before the free trade agreement starts.
So are you saying, Alex, that when the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, says, it has to be abolished, that is merely a negotiating position? Because, of course, we've heard the Irish government saying it's a collision course.
I imagine we're going to reach compromise, and that's the art of negotiation, and I think that's where both sides will come to. And if we're thinking about what that might mean, given that the whole of the withdrawal agreement passed our Parliament except for the backstop, because we saw the Brady Amendment said, if we didn't have the backstop, would you vote for it? It's the only thing a majority of people in our parliament have said yes to. We can look at the withdrawal agreement and think, well, if that's going to go through without the backstop, if we put, for argument's sake, a long stop time limit on the backstop if invoked, 5 or even say 10 years, you've got a 2-year transition period and then a 10-year time on a backstop everyone says they don't want anyway. Who knows where the Irish economy, the British economy or the European economy are going to be in 12 years' time? That's about as pretty, that's more certainty than you're going to get in almost any trading environment.
And yet, of course, you know better than I that there are MPs in your party who won't like that, the so-called Spartans, the 24 out on the extreme, who voted consistently against the withdrawal agreement.
We're going to have, in the end, to decide whether we want Brexit or not.
I think what's fascinating for me, as someone who clearly wasn't born here, is that this is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and does Boris Johnson, a man who clearly loves his own image, want to go down in history as the man who forced the UK out of the EU and led to Scotland leaving Great Britain, Northern Ireland being reunited with the Republic, and Great Britain becoming Little Britain? I can't imagine that's how he wants history to write this.
Well, the obvious answer is no, because he's called it the awesome foursome.
Absolutely. But so he's got to navigate something more than a hard Brexit off the cliff. Or that is a very real possibility.
Just one for Nabila.
And on the issue of the backstop, may I say that, Priti Patel has actually suggested that the threat of starvation, as in the Irish famine, could actually help resolve the backstop problem. So this is the kind of far-right, the reactionary comments and low intellect sound bites we're getting from members of this new administration. And I think it will be a very short-lived one, and a new general election will be called shortly. And I think it is the wider population actually needs a general election in the interest of democracy. As a US broadcaster actually put it, 0.13% of the UK population voted for Boris Johnson to become Prime Minister. And these are essentially elderly, discredited members of the Conservative
I'm just going to let Brian first and then Alex.
There's just, on the backstop, this idea that started a few years ago, where the British were saying they need us more than we need them, was all about trade. The backstop is all about trade. The backstop is not just about a trading border. The reason the Good Friday Agreement is important, and therefore the backstop is important to guarantee that that border stays open, is also about identity.
Which is comes back
it's
to Jeffrey's
It's about the identity of nationalists living in Northern Ireland, which goes to your point exactly about the breakup of the UK. The Good Friday Agreement gives nationalists living in Northern Ireland the opportunity to say, I am comfortable living in this part of the UK because I can say I'm Irish, I'm British, I can have whichever passport I want, and that border will stay open. Now, that's not necessarily about trade. It's simply about national identity, and that is something that is never mentioned or understood on the British side when it comes to the Good Friday Agreement and the backstop. Everybody understands all the stuff about the trucks going over and back across the border for trade, but identity is equally important, and for the Irish government as well, and for people in Northern Ireland, and for the Irish political parties, is at the centre of this as well.
Right, I'm going to rebut both of these ones. On the Good Friday Agreement, people waft at it all the time. It's actually already an excise border, a tax border, a VAT border. Of course, there is an important element of identity which might be determined by having a hard border, but given our government, your government say that they're not going to put one up, who is? Possibly the EU, but otherwise nobody. And on Nabila's idea that it's undemocratic, you seem not to think about parliamentary democracy the way it works in this country, because we had an election that produced by people voted by the millions for Conservative members of Parliament, and then the Conservative Party changed its leader. If you had an objection to people deciding Boris Johnson would be the leader of the Conservative Party, you must have been utterly outraged by Gordon Brown becoming leader of the Labour Party and therefore Prime Minister without even having a vote amongst their members.
Making a very simple point that if the Tory extremist Brexiteers are such great Democrats and they want the British people to take back control, then an election, a swift election, is a must.
You don't think government can change its leader and prime minister without having an election? Because that's not how this country has worked hitherto. So why should it follow the Nabila Ramdani rule?
It's
Seriously.
not the Nabila Ramdani rule. It's the view that it will be a very short-lived government and
So
therefore
are you
unsustainable.
Are you saying, when do you think this election that you're talking about is going to happen? Just very briefly, we're really running out of time now. When do you expect an election?
Well, I think, by the end of the year, to be honest.
I think that, listen, he's got a majority of, three probably going down to two. He's dependent on the DUP for his majority. There is a drumbeat of uncertainty happening here. He could lose his majority, an election could be forced. He could call an election. Stay tuned. Watch this channel.
10 seconds each, Brian.
After Brexit, probably.
After Brexit?
Possibly by the end of the year, but not before Brexit, if he can help it at all.
The Tory party can't go to the polls before we've left the EU.
Yeah.
If we do, we'll be marmalised.
That's right.
So we're going to leave the EU, in your view, on the October the 31st, and then an election, what, next year?
I think so.
I think Boris Johnson actually knows he's going to have to crash out because...
And when does Scotland leave?
Oh, for goodness sake. It does.
Before Northern Ireland, I tell you that.
Nor should it be a light-hearted
It won't be
conversation,
Northern
right?
Ireland first.
It's our country.
It won't be, yeah. But it's going to fall to pieces if Britain crashes out of the EU.
Well, you think Scotland's going to join the Euro? Going to leave the UK, join the Euro? It's just ridiculous.
And on that question, which we don't have time to answer, we are going to have to leave it. Thank you all so much for being here on the panel today. Quite a interesting discussion was had, and we will have another one, same place, same time, next week. Goodbye.